Congratulations on your purchase of a Universal Dynamics robot.
The Wild Robot. I'd love to hear about what sort of attracted you to the novel by Peter Brown, because I know it was in discussion at DreamWorks, but also was something that you'd come across in your own life as well.
I didn't know I was adjacent to it because my daughter was reading it. It's something that's very commonly read at a certain age grade range in the United States. So it was around, but I saw it, but I didn't ever open it up. So I dropped into DreamWorks to see it was up in development, and they described this book, The Wild Robot. I think it was not only the idea of this robot that was lost, which really was, I think, attractive to me, but it was the character relationships. These are the kind of things that I really gravitate towards, things that are less fairy tale and more like real life as far as like the interrelationships and the emotions that are flowing through a story. The more intricate things like that are things that I really gravitate towards. I love fairy tales. Beauty and the Beast, for example, that was one of my favorite things I ever worked on. But things that are more like Lilo and Stitch, where you have fanciful things, but they're in a real environment, like you're treating them as though it's really happening, are the things I like best, I think.
And I think adaptation is also such an underappreciated art form, I think. You know, speaking personally, as a child, I loved the How to Train Your Dragon books. They were such a big part of growing up for me. What ends up in the films is completely different, but it's so true to the essential qualities of the series. What did you see was that essential quality in the book?
The load-bearing themes inside the Wild Robot were really powerful and beautiful. One of them is one, it was revealed to us when I was talking to Peter Brown. Jeff Herman, the producer, and I were on a phone call with him when we first started the project, and he mentioned to us that while he was writing the book, this idea that was running through his head as a guiding principle was the idea that kindness could be a survival skill. And I immediately wrote that down and thought, okay, I need to memorialize that in the script and on the screen. And the other idea that was a load-bearing factor in it, and a driving factor, was the idea that to survive you might have to change your programming. You might have to go off script at some point, but that's not going to mean that you're going to be any less who you are. And so those two things working together were, I think, the main things that I needed to preserve and get from the pages of the book onto the screen intact. So any adaptation was in service to making sure those themes stayed pure.
And just kindness as a survival skill is just the most gorgeous, potent thing in the film. I think it's beautiful. Let's talk about the look of the film, which has this amazing kind of tactile, painterly style. You've described it as like a Miyazaki forest brought to life by Monet, which I think is an amazing, evocative description. What was your vision for how you wanted the film to look?
You know, I was seeing imagery that was very much like, I would say, Tyrus Wong's stylings for Bambi, that kind of sophistication. It was going to mean that that story we were just talking about, I thought, would resonate the way it needed to. I knew that the animals, the robot, would be something that kids would immediately be attracted to and enjoy, and me too. But I just wanted to make sure that it had that kind of resonance and sophistication so that people would see it in the right way, if that makes sense. A more, I don't want to say grown-up exactly, but just, again, I think just being true to the scale of the emotional story that was contained in Peter's book would be the right way to say it.
Kind of epic in scope.
Absolutely. And we wanted people, you know, one of the first things I would say is to Ramon Zivak, the production designer, my dream would be for people to go see the movie and be so immersed in this forest and so beguiled that when the movie ended and they walked back out of the theater, they might have a bit of a shock to see like the real world again, like cars and people walking up and down the streets. I wanted people to feel like they were lost in this forest to some degree.
You can call me Roz.
And you're certainly blessed with an incredible cast to help us get there. Lupita Nyong'o obviously starring as Roz, and kind of on the face of it, she's playing an automated assistant, she's playing Siri, she's playing Alexa, but anyone who's seen the film will know that does not encapsulate the performance that she gives, so nuanced in how it evolves as well. Yeah. I'd love to hear about what her qualities as a performer were that really made you feel she was a good fit, and also maybe how working with her shaped the character a little bit.
Yeah, I cannot understate how much Lupita took the lead in crafting Roz and deciphering her. I would say that Roz is very much like Lupita in that it is she's a very intelligent She's a very intelligent character. Lupita is incredibly intelligent, inventive. I really think she's a bit of a genius, seriously. Watching her deconstruct Roz so that she could understand the architecture of Roz's brain, the way she thought about things, and the way she saw things, was absolutely fascinating. I never went into a recording session and went straight to the microphone. We would always sit and talk. The very first session together, we talked for well over an hour before we committed anything to a recording. And I would leave each session. We would modify things on the spot that we could modify. And then I would leave the session with notes, and I would sit down and immediately apply those to scenes and to the overall arc of Roz, the character. And on top of just deciphering how Roz saw the world and how she reacted to things and how she would literally say them to make sure that people understood as she was saying things how Roz was thinking, Lupita was creating a voice as well. So there's a phase 1, a phase 2, and a phase 3 Roz voice that was crafted by Lupita, where that more Siri thing at the beginning, which has this sort of exuberance and enthusiasm, where she pushes her voice into this hello kind of like place, a more kind of stressed place, but like overly happy. And then as the movie unfolds and unspools, she becomes much more just pure Lupita, I would say. By the third act, that's Lupita. And she's using contractions, and she's even speaking differently. So yeah, I could go on, but it was, I think, one of the biggest, I think, stories behind the story was Lupita deciphering Roz.
It's amazing how she puts herself into the character. I saw this great clip of her recording the dialogue up really straight with her eye. Like, she's in the physicality as well.
Absolutely. As she was doing, and we bounce around in these sessions. We don't do things chronologically. So when we come to a session, there might be parts where Lupita is going to be yelling, for example, and we save those for the very end because that's going to be the most wearing thing on her voice. So we're going to do things out of sequence. So we would always say, okay, this is a phase 1 voice, and Lupita would constantly reset. If she felt she was slipping out of that phase, she'd say hello, and she would reset to like the phase 1 voice as she was doing these scenes to make sure that she stayed consistent.
It's an amazing cast that you have. It's a real like ensemble cast, you know, beside Pedro Pascal, who obviously voices Fink the Fox, Kit Connor as Brightbill. You have Bill Nighy, Catherine O'Hara, Mark Hamill, Matt Berry, Stephanie Hsu. It's an incredible cast.
It is incredible.
It's ridiculous to say.
It's
like
kind
that.
of insane, yeah.
It's so fitting for this film that's really about community as well. I'd love to hear about the experience of bringing all these incredible talents together in service of the film.
Absolutely. The flavor of all these different ingredients was incredible. Like Bill Nighy, for example, I'm just like, he can say 3 words and you're there. Like, and what a great match to the character that he plays, Longneck the Goose, who's like the wisest and oldest character in the movie. And just every time he speaks, boy, you listen. He doesn't have a ton of lines, but the lines he does have move the entire story in a way I can't overstate. And then Kit Connor, who has one of the toughest jobs, because his character, Brightbill, he's good and he's honest and he's earnest, and that kind of a character could come off rather flat. And indeed, we do temporary voices as we're building our story reels until we actually can sit down with the actor, until we get our recording opportunity. And I would drop in and do Brightbill's dialogue, and it was bad. It was awful. You just had, like, I could barely be in the room to listen to the story reel, listening to myself, just thinking, oh, this character.
Man, I hate this guy.
And I cannot tell you how joyous it was. We came to London and recorded Kit, and the very first line that he laid down, we're like, yes, there's Brightbill. He's there. And such incredible depth and warmth and dimension to his voice and emotional content that he brings to it. And imagine, like, and we're taking so many things away from these actors. Like, we leave these sessions with just their voice. We certainly shoot video because we want reference to their expressions so that the animators can take cues from that. But ultimately, it's their voice that we leave with, and that is going to be, injected into the character. So it's a very particular thing to take away, I think, that much of what the actor uses to do their thing. The physicality is just, that's set aside, right? So yeah, to put it all into the voice is pretty spectacular.
There's another very important character in the film we haven't discussed, which is the music. Oh my goodness, this score from Chris Bowers is unbelievable. Please tell me about this collaboration.
Okay, so I learned early on to build what I would call houses for music within these movies, places where the characters would stop speaking and music becomes the primary voice. And that became particularly important in The Wild Robot. And Chris Bowers understood the assignment early on that he was going to have, in a 90-some-odd minute movie, he was going to have like over 80 minutes of music. So it's wall-to-wall music. So just the scale of the task was immense, but the heavy lifting that it did for us emotionally was a major factor. And certainly there are these moments in the film where, like the migration sequence, the midpoint of the film, is one of the most emotional bits I've ever worked on in a film. And it's all Chris. In fact, I put such a premium on his music that in that particular case, in that sequence, eventually I was so concerned that he was trying to maneuver around our visuals. I felt like it might be interrupting how the music was going to be developing and growing. It's like a tree. I didn't want anything to stunt its growth or to cause it to have to grow around like something. I wanted the shape to be what it wanted to be. So I said to him, stop looking at the visuals. Just work on the music. And once you get this music to a place where you're happy, we'll come back in and we'll get into your slipstream and we'll design the visuals around your music. So in that case, the music actually led the process.
There's such a depth of emotion in this film. You know, it's kind of got an element of simplicity and minimalism to its storytelling in some ways, but the emotional ground that we're covering is phenomenal. And I think it's really fascinating, this idea of using non-human characters to tell somehow an even more human story. Like it provokes empathy in a way that's really interesting.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. Robots are particularly good at telling these human stories, and I was wondering about that just out loud one day, and my wife Jess actually pointed out that maybe one of the reasons that robots are so effective at telling human stories is because so many things, any bias you might have to a human actor is going to be removed. There's no regionality, there's no age, there's no gender. All these things are gone. And there's a blank slate that you're writing the story on. And so there's an incredible clarity and purity to what is being transmitted by that robotic character. And I think that's one of the reasons that robots are so good at that particular job and so moving.
Yeah, and it's such a nice juxtaposition with these kind of nature elements, like the wilderness and the animals in the natural world. And I love that connection that's being drawn of like the animal instinct and the robot survival like instinct being kind of similar in a way.
Yeah, and that's one of those things that Lou Peter really brought to the process, because there's a moment where Fink is actually the thing we were talking about. He says, look, you know, kindness is not a survival skill, and he's just laying down the rules of the island, where if you're not completely selfish, you're not going to see another day. And she says, you're programming. And so she's trying to relate what he's telling her about the behaviors of animals to what she runs on, which are programs. So she's trying to relate the world she's in to herself, which I thought was a really ingenious thing.
You're his mother now. He needs to swim and fly.
Fly! How do I get my gosling to swim?
Swimming's easy. I can teach him the way my mom taught me. Swim!
So over this past weekend, we had the 30th anniversary of DreamWorks Animation. We had the UK premiere of this film at the London Film Festival. We've also seen in the news that there might be some plans for a sequel going forward. I wanted to ask, sort of, after working on a film like this for so many years, how does it feel and what does it mean to give it to the world and to reference the film, I guess, let it fly on its own?
I have not been this excited ever before for this moment, for people to see this film, because of all the things that are in it. The style that was created for this film is groundbreaking, and it's so effective and appropriate for this particular film. The voice cast and their performances just were such a joy to be involved in. And for me as a director, just watching this whole thing come together day by day, it was the most energizing, enjoying experience, joyful experience I have ever had as a director, to the point where these are about 3.5 years to make one. And even if you've had a great time and you're very proud of the film, after 3.5 years, you're like, okay, I'm ready to be done, right? But that was not the case with this film. Like, we all just wanted it to go on and on. Every day was just so energizing and so like, again, joyous. And I think the kindness that is the theme of the film really pervaded the whole production, to the point where when we came to the end of animation, each animator, as they ran out of footage, would ask, do you have any other scenes? Do you have one more scene? And we would always be like choked up. I was like, I don't have any more. If I find one, I'll let you know, because we didn't want it to end. And it was a really, actually Jeff Herman said it best. He said, this was really the film of a lifetime. And it's true.
I personally just feel that animation is the closest thing we have to magic that exists in this world. And for me, watching this film in a cinema is like sort of going back to a version of my childhood self, like it's a strength of feeling, a transportation. It was such a magical experience for me. And I'd love to ask you about any pivotal cinema experiences for you, maybe as a child, maybe more recently, and especially in the world of animation. You mentioned the look of things like Bambi or Miyazaki. Yeah. I'd love to hear about what for you has conjured this feeling that I think this film really replicates. Absolutely.
There's so many animated films like Bambi, Dumbo, I think in particular. I think anybody who grew up with animation and loves animation will inevitably mention Dumbo as one of the most sensitive, sincere, I think, moving and disarming stories I've ever seen committed to film. In cinema in general, I have some odd ones that really meant something to me. There's a black and white film. It's a Laurel and Hardy film called The Air Raid Wardens, and there's a moment, because it's just, it's them and their nonsense, right? But that taught me that in the core of a story which is mostly comedy, you can have a moment that is especially serious, and it's incredibly effective when it does fall inside of a comedy, and it has a strong contrast. It's a scene I actually can't talk about because I will I'll be an emotional mess. It's such a simple idea. Likewise, there's a movie called Throw Mama from the Train, starring Danny DeVito, which again, it's a nutty comedy, but it has this moment of sincerity in the core of it that again, it really captured my imagination, and I go back and I watch it from time to time. Yeah, there's a few more I'm sure I could come up with, but oddly enough, those in particular really meant a lot to me, and changed the way that I approached my job.
I truly would sit here and talk about film with you all day if I could, but I am going to let you go, and thank you so much for this. Thank you for the film.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you.
We must become more than we were programmed to be.
Thank you for watching Picturehouse Cinemas' unique video content. Hit the subscribe button to be kept up to date with our movie news, cast and crew interviews, highlights, trailers, and lots more.